So let me first of all say thank you very much for inviting me to come along today. And it's wonderful that you remember the interview with Mr. Feitin. I think it was here, wasn't it, in this room? I think it was, in the auditorium. I studied at the Free University as well, and I researched on the subject of social entrepreneurship. After studying here, I spent 6 years under Mr. Feitin as a scientific assistant. Then I spent another 5 years with various other spin-offs, startups, always linked to the university one way or another. We had some successes, some not so successful enterprises, but it was a very interesting time. I am involved in 5 holdings. I've sold off 1, so I've got 4 left. So for me, as a social entrepreneurship professor, it's not just about talking about it, but I have to stay active in it. So I offer business consulting services as well, and share my experiences. And it's always important to me to be involved in social entrepreneurship. I see my slides up on the screen. So my first aspect is that I'd like to debunk a few myths in the area of entrepreneurship. Now, the first myth is one that I imagine comes from Germany, and Mr. Feitin probably demystified it himself, that it's not just about money. Entrepreneurs don't need a great deal of money to start businesses, so that's one thing you need to know. And I think this is something that entrepreneurship now stands for. I mean, hopefully you have lots of money at the end of it, but when you start your business, you don't need a lot of money. And you don't always have to be some amazing visionary. Sometimes these are just smaller ideas that, if you think them through properly, they can really do well. And it's not the case that the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. You should, in fact, start with smaller risks. And perhaps the biggest myth is the importance of a business plan. I had big expectations of a business plan when I started my work in Germany. I evaluated and said, nice, but has nothing to do with entrepreneurial success. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that, yes, it's useful to have a business plan. We can have a business plan, but we shouldn't overrate it. I think it's overrated. Entrepreneurship is not just something for young and reckless people. 5% of people who found their first startup are over 60. Obviously, it's helpful if you're under 30 because you have less overhead costs. You haven't got your family all set up and everything like that. So there are many reasons to start your business early, but there are many entrepreneurs who have a great deal of experience in life who then go ahead and start their own business. And I think we agree as well that you can foster entrepreneurship. You can teach it. You know, if you don't want to start up a business, you're not going to start one up after our course. But if you've got somebody who would like to start a business, they might be more successful in running their business if they go along to some entrepreneurship seminars. So on this note here, then, I'd like to give you a definition of entrepreneurship that comes from the Harvard Business School, and I believe it's the best, because briefest, perhaps, and most universally true. Entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunities without regard to resources currently controlled, i.e., regardless of whether or not you've got your people together, you've got your money together, just start. That's entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is, I see something that I can change. It could be just in terms of money-oriented, profit-oriented, but it could also be, and I'll say more about this in a moment, it could be about social entrepreneurship too. That you just think, I could do this better. And this feeling of I could do this better, that's what entrepreneurship is. Pursuing this opportunity, whether or not you've got the resources available for it or not. Now, what's a startup? I'm just going to ask you. Can you give me a definition of a startup? We've been talking about startups for years. Berlin is, you know, must be among the top 5 in the world. Startups are sprouting up all over the place. Does anyone know how you can actually define a startup? Yeah. Unfortunately, we cannot hear because the mic's not being used. Nice, he says. He likes it, whatever it was. Passed. You are a certified entrepreneur. So here's the definition of Steve Blank. A startup is a temporary organization in search of a scalable, repeatable, profitable business model. So you are an organization looking for a value-creating, profitable business model. You haven't reached break-even yet. You're not actually up and running and profitable. You're not in the black yet. And as long as you're in that phase, we would describe you as a startup. And once you've settled down, you get established, you're started making a profit, and you're starting to grow again, then it's not a startup anymore. Startups can be quite big, and they still haven't got a profitable business model. You know, Amazon took a number of years, Facebook took a number of years before they actually started making money. In a sense, it's one of the philosophies of startups to say, you know, let's get big first and then earn money later. And if the owners of the company have the money to let them do that, then why not? But most people who start companies don't have such a lot of money, so they can't wait so long. Now let's have a look at social entrepreneurship. And I think that many people who travel, and the previous speaker as well, said that they're often driven not just by profit. There are certain social values that they want to integrate in their entrepreneur activities, and that brings us to social entrepreneurship. Now, we often do seminars where we focus on this subject, and we say it's not something that's definitely black and white. It's either good or bad. It's not binary. There's always a continuum of companies who are only interested in profit. They're towards maybe an investment bank should be at the far right there, JP Morgan, or Lehman Brothers, who no longer exist. A company that does nothing else but earn money. Investment banks have the mandate of earning money. That's all they do. They're only oriented on financial interest. And on the other side of this continuum, then we've got companies that are purely altruistic in their mandate, or a non-profit mandate. Say whatever you like. Red Cross. I think the Red Cross could be put at that end of the spectrum. I always say that anyway. But there are lots of companies that have a social orientation, but also earn money through market economy-based processes. And to give you a couple of examples of these, I started with a company that you may know, Grameen Bank, with all of the advantages and disadvantages of it, the micro-financing that it offers, then the Tea campaign, which was a profit-oriented company. But then if you look at it in a little bit more detail, and this is where I was involved, you can see that actually it's very involved in reforestation in India and in terms of how the profits are spent, etc. And then there's another company, Treberhilfe, for example, in Berlin, somewhere in the middle. It's a non-profit organization, and there's Uncle Tom's Kiez Hütte, a little neighborhood project here in Berlin, or there's the Berlin Football Club, Hertha. You can say that it's a non-profit organization, but it's run by professionals. It's not quite clear. They've got entrepreneurial commitment, but they've also got a commitment to society too. Or AwareNet, an initiative from Berlin that create IT networks in South Africa, in schools. And of course, they're looking at how they can equip schools with the IT that they need. So there are companies that are to be found more at the profit-oriented side of the spectrum, and then there are organizations that are trying to earn money by doing things that are good for society. So let's have a look at some of the success factors of entrepreneurship generally now. Entrepreneurship has generated hundreds of different books. I like Jeffrey Timmons' book if I'm looking for success models, because there's a wonderful little slide there, and you can have a look at it here. He says there are 3 driving forces of entrepreneurship. success factors would be another way of describing them. So we've got opportunity, resources, and lead entrepreneur and the management team, or the entrepreneurial team, rather. Now, you could imagine that these three factors are always in competition, and then you always have to say which is the most important. But which of these three is the most important? What do you think for an entrepreneurial success? The presence of real demand, market demand, or having money, having enough resources to start up properly? Or do you think it's the lead entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial team? What would you say? Which is the most successful? What's the most important? Who's in favor of the team? 1, 2, 3, 4. Who thinks it's opportunity? Or what about resources? All right, you're going for team, and you're absolutely right there. The literature agrees, and I think in real life we see the same as well. The team is decisive, because if you haven't got a good team in place, then the best possible idea you have will get ruined. Whereas if you've got a second-class idea, you can upgrade it with a first-class team. So the team really is the most important aspect here, which is why I'm going to say a bit more about the lead entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial team. What's important there is to always look at the beginnings. I always look at the very beginning. When do startups start up? And it's always ideas. We all know Richard Branson, Virgin Records, and all the things he does. What was interesting is, when did he start? He set up a magazine called Student when he was 16. And he said, I didn't do it to make money. I did it because I wanted to edit a magazine. It wasn't, all the others were too boring. He said, we have to explain the world to students. They don't want to know that the baker across the road has opened half an hour earlier, now sells filled rolls. He attracted people like Jean-Paul Sartre to write an article for his student newspaper. It was about explaining the world. These students are intelligent, they're curious, they want to understand the world. And, doing a student magazine in a new way, that's entrepreneurial attitude, really. I always recommend these two books. They're the autobiographies of Richard Branson and Anita Roddick, who set up the Body Shop. There are two books. One is called The Body Shop Story, which looks at the political dimension. Also worth reading. But if you want to understand the entrepreneur, Anita Roddick, then I would recommend you read Body and Soul. It's a book that you can just read so easily, how she sold chewing gum in the schoolyard, or became the richest Brit when she launched or listed her company on the stock market. And she always said, it's not studying business administration that made her do that. She didn't study business administration. It was always her attempt to improve the world, to contribute somehow or other. That's what drove her and motivated her. So we're talking about entrepreneur in the sense of you have to have a person there who has their own mission and know what you want to achieve. It's not resources only, and still we have to engage with resources. If we just have a quick look, we're talking about equity. Most of these companies, 75 to 80% of startups start their company up with their own savings. So it's not that they work in banks or have venture capital. It's usually just the money they've saved up. They start small. And here as well, you can go into the details. What you need to take away from this is that you have to save up a bit of your own money if you ever want to start up a business. The money you've saved up is what you need to get going. Opportunity. So we said the most important thing is the people themselves. You need to have some savings as well. If you haven't got any savings, you have to meet people who do have money and get the money from them. And for them to give you money, i.e. for them to maybe either lend you the money or give you some equity, you have to have a really good idea, a really good opportunity. So what makes a good opportunity? There's a Berlin entrepreneur here who once said a good opportunity has 3 qualities to it. And I think that this is a really good quote that he's given here. He says, a good opportunity creates real value for my customers. So, it has to, the cost benefit has to be good enough for you to want to buy it. Then it has to make me feel enthusiastic about the idea, because I have to work on the weekend, I have to work in the evening. As an entrepreneur, I'm constantly working. So if I'm not keen on my own product, I might as well not bother. And finally, I have to create profits. Otherwise, I can't keep doing it. So 3 things. The customers have to be keen, I have to be keen, and there has to be some money in it. And then you can make progress with your entrepreneurial idea. Often people ask me where the trends are at the moment. Where should I start up a business? Well, the first trend in entrepreneurship seems to be everything linked to the internet, increasingly everything that has to do with smartphones, the mobile market, particularly here in Berlin. This remains the #1 trend. How many of our students create some little app, start up a business, use some platform or other? It's really things you can do with very little startup capital, just testing out your ideas. And I'm sure that will be one trend. Another trend that I also think is important, perhaps increasingly more important in the public debate than it is on the market, but it's definitely going to come, everything to do with green energy. You know the whole debate, I don't need to go into it here. We've heard all about the environmental impact of travel and how we can change something here. It is a trend, definitely, but so is social entrepreneurship and non-profit entrepreneurship. And there was a book published in 2008 called Megatrends 2010. That's what it was called in 2008 rather. And just guess what the top megatrend in 2010 was supposed to be. What do people think it was going to be? Any guesses? What was going to be the megatrend in 2010, as seen from 2008? The megatrend was spirituality. The megatrend argued very plausibly. It's sometimes described as post-industrial prosperity. Essentially, how can we consume far fewer resources but still maintain our lifestyle? We just heard this in the context of travel. How can we find happiness in the context of our lifestyle by using less resources? And that's the aspect. And of course, in the industrialized countries, we need not more industrialization, we need less industrialization and reduced resource consumption. And then it fits to say that it could have a connection here to spirituality, so we can see where he's coming from. Let's look at the steps of the entrepreneurial process. I've been asked to talk about the principles of entrepreneurship. Now, at the start of any entrepreneurship activity, we are often searching for something. We can imagine to set up our own business sometime, but we don't have the idea that we really believe will be enough to carry us through the next few years. And a process of looking for an opportunity can take a while. If we look at how Richard Branson or Anita Roddick or all of them, all of the others out there, look for ideas. Now, none of their ideas just occurred to them suddenly one morning in the Free University auditorium. No, that was the result of lots of thinking and looking, and it's always trying things out again as well. There's a sort of ambivalence. You have to think things through, but you also have to work out what your clients really need, your potential customers. What do they actually want? And the next step is to come up with lots of small prototypes, try things out. You have to look at your customers' or potential customers' responses. So drafting a business model is important. Lean startup is an important option. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So don't wait for enlightenment. Just try out what you've got already. And if your customers have, once you've identified your customers, you know what your customer might buy, then you can start looking into and investing in marketing and all the communication forms. So to give you the example of the tea campaign that we launched here in Germany, it started in the late 80s in Berlin with us selling tea at a stand on the Winterfeld market or in front of the Free University, when we suddenly realized, hey, look, consumers really do buy 1 kilo of tea, I've always tell this to my Turkish students, and they always say, what are you talking about? Can you even buy tea in non-1 kilo packages? But it was a revolution in Germany, kilo packs of tea. And when we realized German consumers really do buy a 1 kilo pack of tea, then we could invest in infrastructure, and the company has spread. Some people need money for this, and they write a business plan. Lots of people don't need money, and they can just grow from the money that they've got saved up. The growth phase is not so much an issue here. Listing on the stock exchange, exit strategies. This is the end of the entrepreneurial process, but we won't be talking about it much here. This is one of my favorite posters. I saw it at the Humboldt University. It says, if plan A doesn't work, there are at least 25 other letters in the alphabet. And that's exactly a take-home message for potential entrepreneurs here. Most attempts to start a business don't work. And if you've put all your money in your first attempt to set up a business, then that's it. That's why you have to keep your money together. Thrift is the order of the day. And at some point, maybe plan B, C, D, E, or F will work. Sometimes it takes a bit longer. Obviously, we can't predict when you're going to be successful. And management theory can't either. Henry Munzberg, for example, a pioneer in the area of management, wrote 20 years ago that if companies have developed an intended strategy, which are essentially just plans that trained business administration students or managers have drawn up. They draw up a bunch of plans. Some of them actually work and become realized strategies, but plenty fail. I don't know if you followed Euro Disney or Disneyland Paris, as it was called. That was a complete sink for money in the beginning, because mistakes were made there where you think, how could they have done that? How could a group with its huge departments and managers and all the rest of it, how could they make such mistakes? The one I think is the funniest is that they didn't study the eating patterns of their customers. So American theme parks, Disneyland in Florida, they've got a capacity of X seats so that everyone can eat there, the way Americans eat. And then the people who planned Disneyland Paris had exactly the same capacity for the park in France. They just assumed the same capacity because they were assuming that Germans and French visitors and Brits would always eat when there's room in the restaurant. But that's not what Europeans do. They'll all be there at 1 o'clock and say lunchtime. And suddenly there was nowhere to put them. But at 12 and at 2, the restaurant was empty, whereas the Americans are more flexible. They might go and eat at 12 or at 2, but the Europeans showed up at 1 o'clock and wanted lunch and complained how long they had to wait for a table. And all of this led to Disneyland Paris getting a bad reputation, people not coming. So lots of sort of mistakes in the basic planning made by a huge management team, such as a group like Disney has at its disposal. And the list of mistakes made by major companies is huge. And what should we do as small entrepreneurs? Of course, we're going to make mistakes too, and that's why we have to try and keep our money together. And thankfully, there's an idea to describe this. It's called Lean Startup.
Lean Startup, nothing more than nothing less than fighting for Americans. Therefore, well, that's a comparison I'd like to draw. But the philosophy behind Lean Start is based on the idea that everything that you find written into business plans, you can see this in this quote here, is usually far away from where a startup is in the early days. Sure, you've got to have a business plan to convince the money lenders what you want to do with their money, but often it has nothing to do with reality as such. We know basically that basic business plans for the most part aren't put into practice. They are full of false assumptions. That's in the very nature of things. I think it was Ringelnatz, a German language artist or writer, said that predictions are difficult, particularly when they concern the future. Karl Valentin, not Ringelnatz, sorry. So, predictions are difficult, particularly when they concern the future, and of course it applies to entrepreneurs across the board as well. And given that that is so, what I'd like to do now with you is to officially end the business plan and bear in mind That's how simple the world is. If the idea works, it's fine. You get the dollars on board. If not, go back to go and then set up a plan. Because it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in the context of a time, particularly how the customers are going to respond. But there again, that in itself is not surprising. There's an advanced thinker, Friedrich August von Hayek, when it comes to market issues. He wrote, 50 years ago, that the market is a voyage of discovery, because we don't have information available about the future. And to break that down to business startups, that means we've got to keep our money together as founders. We've got to understand our potential customers, and that takes a while to do. And you can't simply do that simply by drawing up business plans and pitching them at the right people, i.e. the providers of funds. Now, why is that not the case? Well, I've brought along the evaluation results for you this morning. There is a model. The 5 forces that are there in the market, you can see prior to set up on the right-hand side what influence these factors have on the startup before and afterwards. We're talking about winners here of business plan competitions. So what emerges here, and this is just the graphic outcome here, almost all the competitive forces are underestimated. You believe before you set up, yes, I've thought of absolutely everything. There is a certain amount, average amount of competition. The purchasing power of the customers is average, but ultimately the market turns out to be much more difficult than the founders originally imagined. The competition is much fiercer, there's a greater degree of stress. And even if I were to write a business plan, and even if I were to receive a award from a jury and they said, yes, I've produced an excellent business plan, nevertheless, you tend to underestimate how tough the market is. And that brings us to the point, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but proceed on a step-by-step basis on into the market. Some people just say, okay, gather experience. It has to do with learning by doing, making mistakes at the outset. You've got to bear that in mind up front. And therefore, the people involved in startups, the founders, and you can see this in the second column, do not see business plan as a success factor. They say, no, experience is much more important. If I know my way around the sector, that's a factor that contributes towards success. And last but not least, I've brought along the results of a further study. We've looked at the lenders of the Berliner Volksbank who wanted to have loans to set up a company. You need a business plan to that end, and the question is, okay, what happens to the business plan after you've set up the business? So the question, is this updated on a regular basis and used? And the outcome is no. The moment I've got the money from the Berliner Volksbank, most of the business startups just put the plan in a drawer somewhere where it just gathers dust. So if that is the case, if I know that most of the assumptions in my business plan are wrong anyway, and it's not going to help me on into the future, then you can be honest enough to say, okay, we can do away with the business plan and essentially we can avail ourselves of other and different instruments. That's precisely my objective. Having done away with the business plan, we're looking at a number of figures here. That's what we're researching into the moment, but in insights. So how can I turn a 50-page business plan into a 2-page spreadsheet table, and what are the figures you've got to concentrate on in order to know, okay, I'm moving in the right direction based on my assumptions. These are correct, and of course others are wrong, but where do we go from here? I'd just like to skip this and move on to the new principle of the lean startup. In Germany, certainly influenced by Günther Feiretin, Brains versus Capital, published in English. This is undoubtedly the key representative of this line of thinking here in Germany. In America, there's a book produced by Stephen Gary Blank, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. Great title. Basically, he says, work closely together with your customers. That's the essence. Now, based on these two approaches, you have the latest book, The Lean Startup. This is the principle I brought along to share with you this morning. It's a question of testing assumptions, not having pages and pages of business plan to put together and then working with that for 6 or 9 months, because in the course of 6 or 9 months, most markets have moved on, particularly in the IT world. And therefore, you've got to be quick onto the market to keep the financial risk as low as possible. And in each of these steps, Sarah Saraswat, American professor, said you've got to define your affordable loss. So in every step you take in the market, you've got to think, okay, how much can I afford to lose without ruining me entirely? And many startups say fail fast and cheap. Now, we know that we're often wrong with what we do. And the question is, we hope not to lose too much money as a result. So testing ideas, product, data, build, measure, learn. Now, this principle applies to virtually all startup projects. Try things out. Does the customer respond as I had assumed? If that's the case, okay, continue, take the next step. If that's not the case, okay, reformulate what it is I have to offer. It all looks so simple and straightforward. It is so hard to do in practice. But again, that's the underlying principle. Or to use a different graphic to illustrate what it is I'm trying to drive at here. We've got these 4 stages in the customer development process. So how do I gain access to my customer? First and foremost, all startups are trying to identify who is prepared to pay money for the service that I have to provide. So are there any customers out there? That's the first question. And if I found a customer, or sorry, how can I find customers in the first place? Okay, test markets, Winterfeld market, or on the internet, just launch a website. I can upload a website and see if people visit the site and order things. And what is crucial in this entrepreneurial process is, do they make a second order? Now, you'll all be familiar with this from your own behavior. Sometimes you just try things out. And sometimes you say, well, never again, too expensive, didn't like it. And then the offer was not mature. But from the very moment the customers say, okay, that was fine, you've gained a positive experience, and they may perhaps buy a second time. So the question is, do they buy again? Now, if I know the customers buy frequently, then I can afford to invest more in communication and what you might typically call marketing or advertising. If I know the customers are prepared to buy, then it really is worthwhile to attract those who have not yet heard of me onto my website, into my shop, to become aware of what it is that I have to offer them. So these are the 3 stages. Now, this is something you need to dwell on for a moment. Not just to engage in marketing. A lot of founders spend thousands of euros at the outset to advertising, or even hundreds of thousands, and say, okay, we want to build a strong brand. And everybody should be familiar with our name, with our brand, our logo. So if you look back what's happened over the past 10 years, companies that whose names became familiar with have all disappeared. Knew the name, but didn't really like the product, for instance. So there's a whole host of them. The biggest of them, don't know if you know them anymore, Webband, for instance, was a delivery service for food in USA, 300 million euros. Almost everybody in America knew the brand, but ultimately it didn't work in practice and went down the drain. Boo.com was the biggest one back in the 1990s, and everybody could imagine, yes, I've got a virtual avatar who wears my clothes. I can see what I look like with my new shirts or jackets or whatever, but it didn't actually work out in practice. Over 200 million euros gone down the drain. Everybody knew what it was, but people didn't buy it. So in order to avoid that situation arising in the first place, you have this concept of a lean startup, or as Mr. Feiten has put it out here, the setting up with components. But there are a few prerequisites that need to be in place here. You need to have a clear concept of the customer. Secondly, I need to make it as difficult as possible for the competition to copy what it is that I'm doing. Because if we do the same thing as I'm doing, then I'm going to be rapidly overtaken by others, perhaps. And as far as possible, I should not be outdated in technological terms, become technically obsolete, that were, and product financing and marketing should run in parallel. Not first having somebody comes with a product, then somebody who's been in administration comes up and does the relevant marketing. That's why I always say to my students, if you do that, you're going to end up a gum tree. Because if an educator comes up with a product and you've got to market it as BA students, okay, you're in a difficult situation. You've got to think this out while you're developing the product in the first place. That's why Mr. Faltin hit upon the idea in his book to say, okay, what we need to have is a startup concept with as low fixed costs as possible. This setting up or startups with various components, modules, building blocks, whatever. I don't have to be my own chef in a restaurant. If I have a concept, a strategy, an idea for a restaurant, it's probably going to make sense. If I can look after the customers, to talk to the customers, to encourage the staff, to make sure they're doing a good job. But I can't do all that if I'm stood in the kitchen at the same time and work as a chef. I don't have any time to do all the other things. What I've got to do is to work for the company, not in the company. Of course, I'll be at the restaurant every now and then, obvious. But if I spend the whole time cooking, then I'm going to end up with a major problem. A company that arose out of the tea campaign, out of the FU. This is ratio drink that Mr. Faltin set up. Who says, okay, if the customers don't order anything, have virtually no cost at all, which is very good. Okay, if the customer doesn't order anything, you don't have any costs. Only if you have a customer who has ordered something, only then is the package filled and shipped. So what's the advantage of this approach? If at the outset I don't have to invest anything, I don't have any costs, then of course the risk of insolvency or bankruptcy relatively low. No fixed costs. Fixed costs are the biggest millstone around the neck of any startup. And obviously, it's going to be the case that most founders are not going to employ people until they've established there are enough customers in the first place. If there are enough customers, then you can employ people. Thirdly, looking at these variable costs, well, okay, I'm prepared to shoulder those if people are prepared to pay good money for high quality, but only if people have actually placed orders. And I can certainly track and follow that very well on the internet. And fourthly, as a result of the lower fixed costs, I can keep my price fairly low, favorable cost-price ratio, and pass on that advantage to the customers by having the best possible cost-effect ratio. And last but not least, you'll be familiar with the situation. If you do everything yourself, you can't be an expert in all fields, then the quality of the service may perhaps not be optimal. If I use this building block or module approach and just invite professionals to do what they can do, logistics, UPS, DHL, for instance, and one of my tax advisors do all the accounting, the bookkeeping, and there's a shipping company that looks after the forwarding processes and so on, then you'll probably end up in a very professional situation in the market. Now, this lean startup process, this building block approach is to be depicted differently, and I come on to the final aspect here. As regards this presentation here, this is the business model canvas. Instead of having 40 or 60 pages of a business plan, the idea arose on the one hand to list the key aspects of my company. Alex Osterweiler from Switzerland did this as part of his PhD thesis, and he said, basically, this is a tool in order to communicate in visual terms what my firm does. And he says, basically, there are 4 areas to whom is my company talking. How am I doing it? What am I doing? And what's the financial impact of what my company does? And the business model canvas has 9 different perspectives, which I can't go into detail here. I think these 4 perspectives are very good, but there are 2 points of departure. One business startup begins by solving a problem for a certain customer segment. That's why it's a point of departure, and therefore in red here on this chart, the customer segment or customer problem that is resolved. Or other startups begin with a resource, a patent, have something special. But there again, you have to see if there's a market for that patented product. That's difficult. It's certainly easier to begin if you can solve a problem for a particular customer in a certain segment. So that's what I wanted to explain to you in the course of my presentation. This is a summary of what I've tried to explain to you. Entrepreneurship is surrounded by a large number of myths. The key myth is that I need a lot of money and a brilliant idea. Neither is the case. No, on the contrary, essentially, it's the case of beginning by talking to customers and solving their problems. And this process, this entrepreneurial process, consists of me assessing customer reaction time and time again and making progress gradually. Then thirdly, the business plan, the 40, 60-page business plan is only meaningful if I already have customers in place and wish to grow. As long as I have no idea of what my business will look like in the future, I don't need a business plan. As long as I am a startup, in other words, business plans are rather an obstacle than a help, because my assumptions will change on a daily basis. Only when I have an established concept business model in place, only then do I need a business plan. And fourthly, the lean startup philosophy depicted in various books, Good to Fighting, Stephen Lang, amongst others. Basically, these books are like a cooking book, much more practical than you probably imagine up front. Therefore, my recommendation would be to anybody who's looking at the issue of business startup should have read these books. Lean Startup is a good book. Even better is a book called Running Lean. The steps are presented in the form of a checklist, and if I've read this book, a number of others, I'm in a good position to get up and go. That was my overview of the entrepreneurial principles in the year 2013.
tatsächlich entrepreneurship-mäßig aktiv sind. Viel Erfolg. Vielen Dank.